a lot of people are pretty confused about all those things. And we're trying to demystify it and make it a little simpler for you because it's really not that hard. It's just a couple of things to keep in mind, and we're going to walk you through that now.
Yeah, this can be more important than you would know.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. Hello, Malcolm. How are you?
Hello. I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm good as well.
Great.
You're in the jam space again, recording.
Yeah,
right?
Back in the garage/jam space recording studio conversion for the band Vogue Violence, recording that album. We are on the second batch of songs, finishing up. Essentially, all the beds will be done by the time I leave here in a couple days, and then it'll just be vocals left and some keys and stuff. So we're close. Be great.
Awesome. Very cool. Very cool. I didn't realize you do it in like chunks. I thought it was like one session and it's done.
Right. Yeah, we decided to. I mean, the plan changed a bunch of times, but essentially we planned to do like half the album in one trip up here and then half the album on the next trip up here. Just let us focus more on the, like, do pre-pro on like a batch of songs. So we're moving pretty quick from me sending them to recording them so I could load them all in, make sure scratch tracks are good and pitch any ideas, workshop them. It was just too hard to focus across 12 songs kind of thing. So this kind of solved that problem for us.
Yeah, makes sense. Totally. Well, before we get to today's episode, I want to ask you a question, Malcolm.
Ready.
I want to hear your opinion on this because, as you know, I've mentioned it before in the podcast. I've been doing a daily blog since like a couple of days or like almost 2 weeks, I think now, which has been fun. And it's like a fun little exercise for me, writing exercise. And on Friday, May 7th, so if you want to check that blog post, it's the post from Friday, May 7th on the selfrecordingband.com/blog. I wrote about something that I've heard in a book, and it was the following. I've read Tim Ferriss's Tools of Titans. I don't know if you read that book or listened to it.
Only some of it.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. Lots of super inspiring people in there and their habits and routines and everything. And Rick Rubin is also in that book, legendary music producer. And he said, and like, or Tim Ferriss quoted him, and he was saying something along the lines of, you should learn from the best instead of your competition. And what he means by that is that he listens only, or not only, but he thinks it's better to listen to the best songs ever written and the best recordings ever made and the all-time like classics that are considered the best to this day. He thinks that is a better way to find your own voice and get inspiration than listening to what's on the radio now and trying to compete with that. Because the more you listen to current stuff, the more you're going to eventually sound like that. But it's better to be like unique. And so he suggests studying the best, getting inspiration, and then finding your own version of what's current, you know? And I thought it's interesting as well. And I was thinking about like, there are people who do the exact opposite, like Jesse Cannon, who you had on the podcast on Your Band Sucks at Business as a guest, who I've heard say a couple of times, I think, that he only listens to new music. He doesn't listen to old music at all. So the complete opposite. And it works for him. And he's always on the lookout for like new releases. He studies what gets people excited. He wants to see trends. He's excited about new music more than he is about old stuff or classics. Right. And I thought it's just an interesting thing to discuss because today's episode is going to be very technical. So I wanted to have this little creative conversation in the beginning.
Right. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just curious where you stand on that. Like, what do you do? What do you listen for inspiration, and what would you suggest you should do? Like, do you listen to the all-time best ever or to current stuff more?
That is almost more so a songwriting position he's got there, right? Where he's listening to the songs, because with production and recording, I think that we've come a long way. I think that the best recordings are happening right now in like a high fidelity, amazing full productions, right? Not to say that old ones aren't cool. You know, I'm going down an Elton Jet kick for a couple months now, and Benny and the Jets has like a flammy delay on the drums or something that's like truly awful, but somehow awesome. I really don't know. Yeah. And But so for me, I'm usually listening to new music, I think. But that is more so for like I'm trying to keep an eye on like how things are continually sounding better and better than they did before and figuring that out. For songwriting, I could see his point more, I think. I could see Rick Rubin's point where there's truly some amazing songwriters that have been out in the past. And I think maybe the lack of like globalized radio, or I guess Spotify in this case, where everybody's listening to the same hits, not necessarily, but more or less, when Black Eyed Peas hit the scene, everybody knew who they were. That was less in your face back in the day. So I wonder if that led to more original songwriting. I can't really say definitively, of course, but I'm curious now.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, could be the case. I'm not really sure where I am on this, like what I believe here, because I do a bit of both, I guess. But it just got me thinking. Maybe I should do more of one or the other, and I'm not really sure. But I can totally see both points. And I mean, people, if you're listening right now and you're thinking about this, let us know what you do. I'm just curious what people are actually listening to, because I know I can't really tell from my clients or from people I'm talking to. I don't really know what the majority does, because it always seems to be the extremes. There are these people who only like the classic rock records and never listen to anything current, and then there are other people who only do the current stuff, just as like those two examples that I've mentioned. But I don't know what most people do, and I don't know what's better, actually. And your point is interesting, because I hadn't really thought about it in terms of songwriting and production. I had it more in a general sense. So interesting. Well, but I think it's a cool idea to not try, or to be aware that you might start to sound like whatever you're listening to constantly, and that to keep that in mind, because that is really, I think he has a point there, that if you are constantly listening to your quote unquote competition, you might start just sounding just like them, which is not unique, and you should do your own thing, probably.
It will definitely creep into your musical tastes and sensibilities, without a doubt.
Yeah. Cool.
I have something to see if you've. I'm going to butcher it, but
yeah.
I just saw a video, I think yesterday, of these MIDI gloves. Have you seen those things?
No.
It's pretty interesting. They are, these gloves you wear, and I'll come back next week with the artist's name, because I'm totally blanking now. But she wore these gloves that interfaced with software on her computer, and she could have different hand gestures going, and you can program different like hand movements to do different things. So she was controlling her own delay throws, panning the effects around her stereo field, creating loops as she sang with her hands, and then changing the pitch of them and creating like harmonies and stuff like that. It was truly wild. So it was like, okay, that could transform how vocalists express themselves on stage. Could be pretty cool. You could actually have all those cool effects that are in your recording in the live show potentially. It was fascinating.
That sounds pretty fascinating. I immediately think of all the things that could go wrong. Like if I don't know how accurate it tracks the gestures and stuff, because it could be all over the place. But
totally. But she did a live performance of like an original song, and it seemed perfect. I was totally impressed by how well it seemed to work. Wow. But I'll find the video and I'll post it in the Self-Recording Band Facebook community.
Oh yeah, do it,
and people can check it out. It's definitely fascinating. It would be a lot of fun, I feel like.
Absolutely, like interesting. I've never heard of that. I have to watch that as well. Yeah, I posted in the community. By the way, if you're not in there, it's the selfrecordingband.com/community, or just search it on Facebook, and you're gonna see that video. I'm curious to see it as well. That sounds way like crazy.
It's crazy, for sure.
Cool. Now we actually start now, I promise. But one more thing, if you haven't downloaded it yet, go to the selfrecordingband.com/10-step guide. It's a free, almost like a mini ebook, free PDF guide that walks you through 10 steps from like planning the whole project and like songwriting, arrangement, all of that, all the way through pre-pro, recording, mixing, mastering to the final product. Like it outlines the whole process and gives you sort of a roadmap. So if you want to download that, it's completely free, the selfrecordingband.com/10-step guide. And yeah, there we go.
Awesome.
Okay, so today's topic is one that is necessary because a lot of people are asking for it. It's not necessarily the most creative episode, but it's absolutely a must know. So if you don't know about this stuff, um, this is the episode. It's about configuring your software, your DAW, setting sample rate, bit depth, um, basic settings that you do once, like when you buy an interface or a DAW and you connect them for the first time, like how you set that up, and then also how to set up your sessions so that you're recording in the right format, stuff like that. So it's a basic configuration episode, but we realized that a lot of people are pretty confused about all those things. They don't really understand the terms, or they are not sure what sample rate might be the best. And we're trying to demystify it and make it a little simpler for you, because it's really not that hard. It's just a couple of things to keep in mind, and we're going to walk you through that now.
Yeah, this can be more important than you would know. I've definitely had folks send me tracks thinking that it's as tight as they can get it, and I'm hearing it and I'm like, okay, this is really bad, really loose, something's wrong. I'm pretty sure they are trying to record through this like crazy latency or something, and they just think that's how it is because they didn't know you could change it. And that turned out to be the case in at least one of those situations. So this could make recording so much more fun for you. It'll actually feel like you're playing your instrument again, which is great. And obviously it's essential to a good result as well. So I guess we should start right at the beginning. Just you get an interface, you pull it out of the box. First thing you got to do is figure out how to plug it into your computer.
yeah, exactly.
That's usually pretty simple. Figure out if it's a Thunderbolt 3, Thunderbolt 2 interface, or whatever. Make sure it comes with the cord, which a lot of them don't. You'll have to get that. But then generally you're in. Sometimes you will have to install drivers to make it work with your device. Some seem to just have that figured out without. I have no idea how that works, but make sure you do what it recommends. Or
read the manual. It's always good advice. Read the manual.
It's good advice. Now, then I think the real first important thing is realizing that a lot of interfaces come with software of their own that will run kind of in parallel to your DAW. So in not all of them, though. There's a couple that don't. But in the case of my Universal Audio stuff, there's a program called Console that I opened, and it controls my interfaces before it hits my DAW, Pro Tools in this case. I know Focusrite has one called, I think it's called Control or Remote or something. I don't know. But, and then RME's like Total Mix, I think, right?
Yes.
So a lot of them have that. And those are really important and very helpful as well. So make sure that is installed and then read the manual on that, because that is what's going to make recording smooth for you, is understanding how to operate that.
Yeah. You can think of it as like a digital mixer. It's just like a mixing desk. It's inside your computer, but it's basically your interface, if it has a software like that, is like a digital mixing board. Basically, it has inputs and outputs and faders, and you can route audio from one point to another. You can, it's a mixer that is separate from your DAW and controls stuff before it hits the DAW, and also controls stuff after it leaves the DAW before it comes out of your speakers again. So it's just a software control for your interface, because otherwise you would have all the 1,000 knobs on your interface, and it would be a desk essentially. And now, in this case, it's a software version of that. Now, one basic thing that people need to understand, I think, is that your interface, what we call an interface here in this episode, is basically replacing your sound card in your computer. So it's not that's a concept that some people don't understand. I think it's you have a sound you already have an interface in your computer, a very simple one. You have a headphone jack and maybe a built-in microphone. These are in and out devices, and there's a converter in there, and it's basically a built-in audio interface that connects the outside world to your computer, the outside audio world to your computer. And if you buy a recording interface, it's just an advanced version of that. It just replaces the sound card in your computer. It's just an external sound card, basically. And now when you open up your DAW, which is the recording program that you use, you now have to, first of all, select that new sound card in most of the time. So there is probably a preferences menu or something like that, and you can select audio devices. It's called differently in every DAW, but You select the audio device that the DAW should like communicate with, and you should, instead of the internal sound card, you should choose your interface now, so that the DAW knows the inputs come from that interface and the outputs go to that interface. That's step number one.
So how you know that isn't working is if you plug in your new interface and the sound is still coming out of your laptop speakers.
Yeah.
That is because it's using the wrong sound card. It's using your internal sound card in that situation. So once you switch it, it should start routing audio to your new sound card, your new interface, and then ideally audio would be coming out of the speaker out of that or the headphone out of that box.
Yeah, exactly. Now, next thing is you got to assign the inputs and outputs in some cases. Sometimes this is automatically done if it's just one or two, but sometimes you have to actually tell the software, the DAW, that there are now 8 inputs and they're coming in on, I don't know, the 8 XLR inputs on your interface, and that there are, I don't know, 4 outputs and they are going out the main left and right and maybe a headphone or whatever. So you have to tell the DAW the actual physical outputs and inputs and assign them to software outputs and inputs in your DAW.
Yes. Sometimes there's like automatic solutions to this. So you open up your DAW and just like click default on the IO, and sometimes it just maps to whatever the current sound card is and you'll be up and running. You might not be that lucky. And you'll have some Googling to do to figure it out. But in either case, learning to do this stuff is just going to be a helpful kind of like trick to have in your bag of tricks. Because if something, you go to a friend's house to record another song or whatever, and something comes up, you just knowing this stuff keeps things moving. It's worth kind of getting confused with for a bit.
Yeah. And once you've done that, once you've assigned the inputs and outputs, when you now create a track in the DAW, like an audio track, then you can assign an input and an output to that audio track. And it should, like, what should show up is the inputs and outputs that you've created and like configured before. So now you can, let's say for this podcast, I have an empty session. I create a track called Benedict, my voice. And I click on that and I select, I don't know, XLR1 on my interface. And that's where my mic is plugged in. And if I configured the interface correctly and assigned the right inputs, I should now be able to get signal in a level on that track.
Mm-hmm.
If I select input 1 and I have no signal, then input 1 is not properly configured. It's not connected to my actual physical input.
Yeah. Your IO is not mapped correctly. IO meaning ins and outs.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a good thing. We didn't even have that on our outline here, but it is definitely important and mystifying sometimes when you can't figure out why it's not working.
Yeah, totally. Same with the output. Like your master output is probably, I don't know, 1 and 2, probably. Mm-hmm. Output 1 and 2 could be whatever, but let's say your master is set to output 1 and 2, and if you're getting no sound, you gotta go to the preferences, audio device settings, whatever it's called in your DAW, and see if software output 1 and 2 is actually going to your physical output 1 and 2.
Yeah, definitely. Good news is you generally only have to do this once. You can save your settings and lock it in, and then your studio kind of becomes routed. You're done. So that's great.
True.
Maybe we should jump to our sample rate and bit depth then.
Yeah.
Without getting too technical, you do need to be aware that these are settings that you have to set every single time you make a new session. And you can control it on your interface. So generally through that external software that we mentioned will come with your interface. Open that up. It's your digital mixer. You should be able to set the sample rate in there for what your sound card is running at. So that'd be 44.1 or 48K or 96 and so on. And we'll talk about what we recommend in a second. But you also have to do that with your DAW, with your session. So when I open Pro Tools and make a new session, it asks me what sample rate and what bit depth I want to make that individual session at. It's really important to think about that and get it right.
Yeah. And it's not always the same for every DAW, because in Cubase, for example, if I open up a new session, if I create a new session, it doesn't ask me that. So I need to double check. I need to go to the preferences menu, or there's a bar like a toolbar at the top where it shows me the sample rate and the bit depth. But I have to check that. It doesn't ask me to what I want to do. And I think with most most interfaces that people use, like the all-in-one interfaces, typically if you set a sample rate in your DAW, the interface will automatically change to that sample rate. It's not always the case, so it's always worth double checking. And for some interfaces, it's different. But usually, when you change, like with my portable all-in-one interface, when I set a different sample rate in Cubase, the interface will just match that. There's no control on that small interface. With my converters in the studio, however, they don't do that. So if I set a different sample rate in Cubase, I have to also set it at the converter. If I don't do it, I get an error message, or I see like the color changes, and it shows me that it's not synced. But I still have to do that manually and have to double check it.
Right. Yeah. It is much more important that you get it right with the DAW, because like you said, your interface, you can just change it. It's that's fine. But if you're listening back to audio and it seems slowed down or sped up, you probably got this step wrong. So you'll want to set that. I like to set it in the DAW and then double check that it is the same on the interface sound card, just for keeping my brain happy to see the same numbers.
Yeah, same.
Now, should we talk about what settings we recommend?
One more thing. If you are using an additional preamp, an ADAT preamp, like something with a built-in converter to get more inputs and outputs, that has a converter in it as well, if you're connecting it digitally through ADAT, for example. And in that case, you got to check that device as well. And it's usually synced to your main interface, but it's worth checking. And also in that case, whenever you have more than one digital device together in your setup, you need to define a master clock. Only one device can be the clock. So you don't need to really know what that is or how it works. It's just one device is that determines the sync, the timing, whatever you want to call it. But you have a master clock, and everything else is called a slave in that situation, in that configuration. And it's important because a typical error that people get is the recording works fine and it seems to be the right sample rate and everything, but you get like weird clicks and pops in the audio that just appear randomly or seem to appear randomly. And that can be the case if, for example, your interface, both the interface and the external preamp are both set to master, for example. So you're using two clocks, they're not synced, and you get this audio dropout thing, these weird clicks. So make sure that one is the master, everything else is a slave to that, and you have the same sample rate set, and then you're good to go.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, what settings do you actually use is the question then. I remember when I was learning to like Pro Tools or to record, even in general, I would just like make a new session and then read through anything, and if I didn't understand it, I would just ignore it and keep going. So that's why we want to talk about this a little bit. And to a degree, I feel like I still do that.
Yeah, I can relate. Yeah,
I feel like now I just find out if it's dangerous if I don't know it, and then once I feel safe that I can continue without caring about it, I just continue.
yeah, exactly. Pretty much what I do as well. So, yeah. So what do you use, Malcolm? I'm curious.
I use 24-bit 48K. So 24-bit being the bit depth, and 48K being my sample rate almost exclusively. And that is because it's what I was first shown. It seems to be the most popular by a landslide. And then it is also what the film world uses. So that just kind of like, okay, I don't have to think about it anymore. If I just use this, that removes 99% of the conversations about bit rate and sample rate in my life.
Yeah, same, absolutely same. Let's start with sample rate before we get to bit depth.
Cool.
I think there is no reason to use 44.1 because 48 is not a lot. Like with increased sample rate, the file size increases and the CPU load increases. But from 44.1 to 48, it's not a big change. So there's really no reason to use 44.1. It's like sessions will run just as smooth at 48. And in my head, like I might be wrong, but to me, it's more logical. And I think it sounds better to have the 48K version for video, for example, because that, as you said, it's the video format. So also if you're doing music videos, that's just the format that you can upload that to whatever, to most, like I think video platforms. And it's better to have that in the original sample rate and not having to convert that and to just create a 44.1 version if you need that, than starting with the 44.1 and having to upsample it to 48. So I think starting in the higher sample rate and then creating a 44.1 version from that makes more sense to me, and I think it sounds better. But there's no.
Well, that is that's essentially what we're doing as recording people, musicians, and engineers. Is we're recording at a very high fidelity, and then eventually it's an MP3 on Spotify. So we're purposely choosing to work at a high quality, so that we can reduce it in the best form possible to whatever it needs to be to get to a consumer. Now, of course, there are higher sample rates and resolutions, which in theory would sound better, but we've just surpassed what the human ear is capable of, essentially. So, I mean, there's definitely the jury is out on this. There's definitely people that think you should go higher for sure, but in general, most people don't. And 24-bit 48K is how a lot of your favorite records have been made for years and years now.
Yeah, even 44.1 in some cases, but as we said, like really no reason to go for 44.1. But everything higher than 48 depends on so many, like you can't give general advice here because it depends on whether or not you use outboard gear. It depends on which converters you use. Some converters sound better at a certain sample rate than others. It has to do with the filters that are built in there and like a lot of technical stuff. And we can't give general advice here, but I think it's very rare that it makes sense to go in a typical home recording scenario. It's very rare that it makes sense to go above 48 kilohertz. It will just make the sessions unnecessarily large, and will give your CPU a hard time. And so no, stick with 48. I think it's a good advice. And I also would say, when in doubt, as always, just do a test. Just see what happens. Like record at 40, do a test recording at 48 and then do one at 96 and see if it really sounds better. And if you find it really does, then more power to you. Do it. But
totally,
we think it's unlikely that it will sound better.
I did a few, and like you said, the CPU was just struggling harder in the mix sessions with it. So I was like, okay, this is just slowing us down. There's no advantage to this. And then I've done 44.1 as well, just on a whim. And client was very happy with how that turned out too. It's not going to make or break your record. So I would say 48 is kind of what I want to be the standard. What the goal of this podcast is. No, I'm joking. But honestly, you're going to be fine no matter what you choose. Choose what's going to work on your computer. If you have a computer and you think that little slightly bit less 44.1 is going to help it get the job done, then sure, you'll be fine. Go ahead.
Absolutely, exactly. Side note, if you are seeing or listening to or watching like content or posts from, like, for example, mastering engineers who work at higher sample rates, they do it for different reasons, maybe. So I know some mastering engineers who will get like a 44.1 mix or 48K mix, and they will upsample it first, then work on the master, and then downsample again. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be their converters. It could be that they prefer upsampling it versus using oversampling in a plugin. That might sound different. It's just a very technical thing now, but I'm just saying this because I know that some people will be like, well, I saw this one guy, he always like upsamples stuff and he always works in 96K. That doesn't mean it's better to record at 96K. It can have different reasons. Yeah. So there's that. Stick with 48. Now, there is an exception, and we've already mentioned that in a previous episode, where you could have an advantage, where the higher sample rate could have an advantage to it. And that is if you do some editing tasks, time stretching in particular, higher sample rates could give you better results. Because if you think about it, 48 kilohertz means there's 48,000 samples per second in the digital audio. So you have 40, for lack of a better term, 48,000 steps per second. And if you have 96, it's double that. And if you now stretch that audio, you have, like, in theory, it's hard to describe, but in theory, you should get a more precise result that way, because you have just more. Can you try to explain that? It's really hard to explain. It's like I wouldn't know how I would explain it in German, but maybe it's easier for you.
I mean, it is kind of a hard thing to explain. I like the steps analogy, where you picture the waveform chopped up into little steps,
Yeah.
right?
But it's an analogy, by the way. It's not really the stair steps thing. I need to say that because that is wrong.
Yeah.
It's like points more than steps, but it looks like steps. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you picture having 48,000 or 96,000, you've got way more little anchor points to control as it is spread out.
That's
right?
the word.
And that should, in theory, make a more complete photo or picture of your audio once it has been stretched. In that case, especially on the stretched rather than shortened situation.
Yeah.
So you should have a little more power in what you're able to pull off with time stretching stuff if you use a higher resolution.
Yeah. What that means for you is if you think your audio needs some heavy editing, like you have really, like you're having timing issues, you are working on a vocal that's supposed to sound very natural, but needs some, pretty heavy editing moves to make it work. If that's the case and you're afraid that you're going to end up with artifacts that you don't want in your audio, then it might be worth trying a higher sample rate.
Yes. Yep, exactly. Now, bit depth. What do you use?
24. It's most interfaces can do 16 or 24. There are converters who can actually, like where you actually record in 32 float, I think, but it's not a standard. And I don't even want to talk about it. Record in 24. What you need to know is internally, because you might come across that, and it's always a bit confusing. You might find in the settings somewhere that your DAW works with 32 or even 64 bits. What that means is like internally, the signal flow internally in your DAW works at 32 or 64 bits, but you are still recording 24-bit WAV files.
Yes.
That's two different things. So there's one setting where you set the recording format. That should be set to 24. And then internally, it should be set to 32 or 64.
Yeah.
Those are two different things. With 16-bit, I need to say that because a lot of people think or they compare bit depth to, for example, a resolution in an image, in a JPEG or whatever image file, which is not a great analogy to me, in my opinion, because a 16-bit recording will not sound worse or less detailed than a 24-bit recording. What it does is it reduces the dynamic range. So the quietest stuff and the loudest stuff will not be as far apart, if you will. So the noise floor will be higher. You would have to be more careful with levels. So back in the day when there were only 16-bit converters, records sounded just as fine, but people needed to use higher gain settings and like compress and limit on the way in. So because if you were recording really quietly, the noise floor could become really annoying. And with 24 bits, the dynamic range is drastically increased and noise is not an issue anymore. So, but it's not that a 16-bit recording sounds a lot worse or more distorted or whatever. No. It's just, that's just not the case. So if you accidentally record it in 16-bit and it sounds fine and there's no annoying noise, you're going to be fine, probably. You should still record in 24, but it doesn't mean that you absolutely have to redo everything if there's no issue. I just want to say that 16-bit is not a real problem, but still, now that you know it, record in 24-bit.
Yeah, absolutely. 24-bit is the way to go. Again, if you choose 24-bit 48K, you'll just have to talk about this less in your life, and that's a good enough reason.
Yeah, and also with 24-bit, you don't have to crank the input gain, not at all. You can record very, very quietly because the noise floor will be very, very low. Yes. And depending on your preamps and everything, of course, but it's like when in doubt, record a little quieter and just avoid clipping. Whereas with 16-bit, you would have to get as close to the 0 dB point as possible. But you don't have to do that with 24, not at all.
It's what I should have done with this podcast. You might notice a clip earlier in this waveform because I was rushing my setup in this new room.
Yeah, so 24-bit 48K, write that down, use that, and you'll be fine. It will be the right setting in 99% of all projects. So
exactly.
Cool. Now, with that out of the way, there is one more thing you can set probably in your DAW. You should know how to set this right, and that is the buffer size. Now, what is buffer size? It's another nice thing to explain on a podcast.
Yeah, buffer size is it buffers your audio so that it can play it all back at the same time. So if you have a bunch of software processing on your drum bus, but not on your vocal, and then there's a reverb or a sampler doing something else on a different track that has its own latency, the playback buffer gives the computer time to think and align all of those things and then spit them back to you in time so that you hear it as you intended.
Yeah. The lower the buffer size is, the more real-time processing you're hearing, basically. And the more buffer size you have, the easier it is on your CPU, because it's measured in samples usually. It's like sample blocks. So you can set, I don't know, 1024 or 2048, which are the biggest usually blocks that your sizes that you can choose. And you can use very small buffer sizes, like 32 samples or something like that, which is almost real time. And yeah, you can basically decide how hard your CPU has to work in real time. That's basically what it is. So lower buffer size, less latency, almost real time processing, tougher on the CPU. Larger buffer size, more latency, because your computer like looks ahead and does all the math before you actually hear it, which results in more latency. But it will be more stable, less CPU usage. So typically in a mix, we use a higher buffer size. I set it to the max most of the time when I mix.
Agreed.
And when I track, I use this, and I monitor through the DAW. I use the smallest buffer size I can without my computer.
Yeah, exactly. Because
dying. So
yeah, you have to think when you record audio into your interface, it then gets sent to your DAW, and then for you to hear it out of your DAW, it has to get sent back to the sound card again, and then to your speakers and to your ears, right? And that is called like the round trip latency, how long that takes. So if you have that buffer cranked up, it takes a long time. And you'll notice, you'll pluck your guitar string and you'll hear it slap back a second later or whatever. And that is a problem if you're trying to perform through that. So by lowering the buffer as much as we can, you can make it sound pretty much real time, and hopefully not even be able to notice that it's happening. It's so quick.
Yes.
And we should quickly add that in some DAWs, like in Pro Tools, there is a button for delay compensation that needs to be turned on. It by default is for me always, but I've heard horror stories of people not being able to figure out what's going on with their tracks, and it's just been somehow turned off. So make sure delay compensation is enabled in your DAW, or else all hell will break loose.
Yes, totally. Do that if it's required. It might even be required, or there might even be a button in Cubase. I just don't remember because I never have to use it. It just does it automatically. But there might be some checkbox that I once checked and forgot about it. I don't know. Totally. So yeah. Delay compensation is absolutely critical. Now, in some DAWs, you also see not only the buffer size in samples, but once you set the buffer size, you'll see a latency value, a round trip latency value, for example, or an input and output latency value in milliseconds. Just as a basic like guideline to help you get an idea of what is usable or good or not, or might cause problems. Everything in the single digits will probably work. Like the lower the better, but like up onto 7, 8, 9 milliseconds, it should sound close to real time. You might get some phasing maybe, but it shouldn't sound like an echo. And everything like from 10 milliseconds and more will sound like a delay usually. So like it's rule of thumb. It's not really accurate, but if you're way below 10 milliseconds, it should be good. If you're above 10 milliseconds, it's too much to really have proper monitoring.
Yeah. All right. Now, there is one more workaround we should discuss, and it's how to get around that round trip of having to send into your DAW and then back out of it. And that is with low latency monitoring options that are built into your interface. And what that means is instead of having, say, my voice right now going from my microphone into my interface, into my DAW, back to my interface, back to me, which would create that round trip. What you can do is have it go from the microphone to the interface and then directly to me. So it's getting sent before it even goes to the DAW to my ears via headphones in this case. I'm literally using it right now, actually. And that is marginally shorter, but very immediate. And that's going to be a lower latency monitoring option, which is great. So you can have pretty much instantaneous monitoring by using these low latency built-in options with your interface. They require you to understand how to use that included software with your interface, of course, because that's what you're using to monitor through. And it is still recording into the DAW. So it is still getting sent to the DAW. We're just not listening to it there. That is the key difference. That track could be muted, or most DAWs have some kind of low latency option where it knows that it's being recorded onto that file, so it just automatically doesn't play back audio from that channel. And that has been really cool. I've been using that a lot lately with my interface, and it's just low latency every time. It's fantastic.
Yep. 2 things to add to that, because the downside of it, that's the one thing, the first thing. The downside of that is that you have to check after the fact if the recording went well. Basically,
Yes.
It usually does, but you have no real-time control over that. So as you're hearing the signal before it hits the DAW, you don't actually know what it sounds like coming back from the DAW.
Mm-hmm.
That's the downside. So whenever possible, I like to monitor through the DAWs, because then I know that what I'm recording is what I'm hearing and it's good. I made that mistake once in a podcast where I was interviewed, and I had my phone next to me because I was on the telephone with the person interviewing me, and I was also recording to my DAW.
Right.
And I didn't listen to what was coming out of the DAW, and just had the person on the phone and record it. And then I hung up, and I wanted to export my audio, and I found out that I had all these like phone interference artifacts, weird noises in my recording, and it was basically ruined, and I had to fix it, which was not easy. And so had I listened to my own voice through the DAW, that would not have happened.
Yes. I mean, in theory, it should be the same, but there's definitely shit goes wrong. I agree. I don't know why that is, but we actually have on our checklist for this podcast, we have a turn cell phones to airplane mode because of that.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that's the first thing I want to add, like the downside of not really listening to what you're recording. But the other thing is that now you mentioned doing that with the software mixer or software that comes with the interface, the low latency mode. So you're still having the conversion. You're still converting it to digital. You're routing it right back to the output, and it's almost real time. So that works, and that's a solution that most interfaces give you. There is, however, another way of doing it with some interfaces, and with my little portable interface here, I have a hardware knob that says wet and dry. And what that does is, if I set it to wet, I'm hearing whatever comes back from the computer. If I set it all the way to dry, I hear the input without any conversion, like the analog path right from the mic to the output, to the headphones. And it's really like, it is real-time monitoring. It's like an analog mixing desk with a headphone out.
Right.
So that is also an option, which is the ultimate low latency mode. And if you have that, I just say that because it's so confusing, and I understand that it is confusing. So if you use that, you got to make a decision. You got to, with any of those low latency modes or the wet dry knob or whatever, you got to choose, do I want to monitor through the DAW, or do I want to use the direct monitoring? If so, do I want to use the software or even the hardware thing that like my interface has? Because you don't want to hear yourself twice. You don't want to get that weird slapback. So let's say you overlook that wet dry knob and it's like 50% or so. So you're going to hear a little bit of your voice in real time, but you're also going to hear what's coming back from the computer. And if you have software monitoring engaged in the computer, you're going to hear your voice twice. And it will sound weird and phasey. So you got to make a decision there, and you got to make sure you've set everything correctly. So if you want to monitor through the DAW, set that knob to all the way wet so you don't hear any analog signal. Then arm the channel, activate the monitoring on that channel so you actually hear that, and you're monitoring through the DAW. Set the buffer size as low as possible so you're not getting any latency, any audible latency, and you're good to go. If that doesn't work because your CPU can't take it, or the latency is just too much, turn off the monitoring in the DAW. Make sure there's no sound coming out of your DAW when you talk into the microphone, and then, or when you record whatever you want to record, and then turn on the low latency mode or the direct monitoring or whatever it is called, or turn that mix knob to the right and only use the direct monitoring, one or the other, basically.
Yes. Yeah, you don't want to be hearing any kind of flammy, phasey stuff. If you're hearing your source twice, I think you can improve on that situation without a doubt.
Yeah. If you're using a digital desk or even an analog desk before your converters or interface, which some people still do, some have, like you might have an analog desk in your jam space that you use for recording as your preamps or whatever, or maybe you have a digital desk that you use. You can create monitor mixes before the interface even on that desk, which is absolutely real time, no latency, not at all. You have like probably good routing options, so you can totally do that. Just check your recordings if what you're recording is really sounding good. But that's like the luxury of having an analog desk. Even if it's just a small one, you can like create multiple headphone mixes on that desk without any latency, without causing your CPU any trouble. And you could try that if software monitoring doesn't work for some reason.
Definitely. Can't stress enough how important getting your latency and monitoring is to getting a good recording. You just simply can't play if you're playing too high of a latency and it's slappy and delayed sounding. It'll throw you right off, and you'll be trying to catch up and slow down, and your performance will be terrible. So this should not be overlooked. If it seems weird, it is weird.
Yes, totally. Yeah, I think we've pretty much covered it. Yeah, one thing comes to mind. I had this with an academy student of mine, and also a couple of other people since then. We had a discussion about how to actually make multiple monitor mixes if you just use a standard, like all-in-one small interface. And the problem with that is, and it's part of software configuration. If your interface has, let's say, 4 inputs, but only one headphone out and one left and right main out, you can't do multiple monitor mixes. All you have is that main out and the headphone. And if you're lucky, it lets you do 2 different mixes. If you're not lucky, they are like playing back the same mix. So you might be able to do one mix and that's it. And it doesn't matter if you add a headphone amp with more channels or anything, it will still be the same source, the same mix. So you cannot create 4 different headphone mixes in your DAW if your interface only has one headphone out or one main out. So if you want to do that, you either have to connect an external extension to your interface, like a preamp with more inputs and outputs, like outputs in that case, through ADAT, for example, or you have to upgrade to a bigger interface. There's no way around that. So, yeah, I've had a couple of people try to make it work, but it just doesn't work. You need physical outputs to do that, and you need the option to assign different software mixes to those different outputs in order to make that work.
Yeah, that is unfortunately one of the more limiting things in the really entry-level mixers or interfaces generally, is they don't give you a lot of output options.
Yeah. And if you have an 8-channel interface, for example, and still only have 1 or 2 headphone outputs, you might have line outputs in the back, and you can assign them as outputs in your DAW, just as we described. Inputs and outputs can be assigned to the actual physical outputs. And all you then have to do is connect a headphone amp to those line outputs, and you can use them as headphone mixes. So
exactly,
if you think I only have 1 headphone output, so I can only do 1 headphone mix, look at the back. If there are line outs, you can use those.
Precisely.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that's more than enough on that topic. It's not the most fun thing to talk about, but it's very essential. And I know for a fact that people will find this helpful because I get a lot of questions about all that stuff.
Yeah. Thank you for sticking through it with us. I think this was my first ever podcast, episode 50 or 66, right?
Yeah, 66.
And my first episode ever without a cup of coffee before it or during it. So thank you for if I didn't fall asleep without noticing. But
and you guys can't see Malcolm, of course, but I can see him and I can tell that he didn't have coffee. So I think it's not as bad if you only listen to it, but if you see him, like I have a hard time not getting tired as well. But
I'm glad this isn't our first YouTube video format podcast for sure.
Yes, exactly. We should definitely start with that. No, that's it. A couple of cool things are coming up that we can't really talk about right now, but we have been planning some stuff, and we'll be back next week with another episode. And thank you for listening. Bye.
For sure. Bye.